So that was terrific. The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel. Wow. Amazing. We have the wonderful pleasure of now being joined by the filmmakers, Joel Bakan and Jennifer Abbott. I'm Brett Pulley, and I'm the Atlanta Bureau Chief at Bloomberg News, and also on the board of 100 Reporters. And hi, Joel. Hi, Jennifer. It's terrific to see you both.
Great to see you, Brett.
Yeah, thanks so much for screening our film.
Well, I have to tell you, it was really my pleasure. It's incredible. And I mean that. I thought I learned so much watching this, and you know, I fancy myself as someone who thinks that they know a few things about corporations and about the country and about capitalism, etc. But I thought that you guys really did an amazing job of pulling it together narratively and also cinematically. Really impressed. Joel, I know that this is based on a book by you, but what prompted an unfortunately necessary film sequel? Why was it indeed necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book was also a sequel because the first film also had a book attached to it. And it really was about a decade after the first film came out. And we had a big sort of event, a big party celebrating 10 years after the corporation. We rented a theater, we filled it up with people. And I was sitting and watching that first film, and this would have been about 2014. And about halfway through, I thought to myself, why are we celebrating? Every single thing that we looked at in this film has gotten worse. Climate change is worse, democracy is more in crisis, racial, economic, gender inequality are worse, corporations are bigger, corporations are more powerful, they're less under the control of government, they're more controlling of government. So I really began to think about the landscape that we were in. And another part of the landscape was that since just about a year after the first film came out, corporations really deliberately started to say, we've changed now, we're different. It's almost like they were saying, you know, you called us psychopaths in the first film, now we're on the road to recovery. And, you know, we're sustainable, we're socially responsible. And these aren't just at the periphery anymore. These are ideas at the core of our operation. So the world is getting worse. Corporations say they're getting better. They're getting bigger. They're under less control. They are more controlling. What a world we're in. And I thought, you know, it's really time to start thinking about looking at this issue again. Obviously, the first film didn't do the job of you know, dealing with corporate capitalism. So unfortunately, we have to take another kick at this can.
Yes. Wow. And then this whole notion of this really wonderful way in which you've illustrated it and underscored how these corporations, as they change their message, as you pointed out, that the message has really become, and the belief has become, that they are the answer to societal problems, right? And they've been able to cast themselves as such. And talk a bit about that. I mean, I was really fascinated by the way in which you did it. And it, you know, in fact, I'll jump ahead a bit. One, tremendous footage, right? Tremendous film clips and stuff. And so I definitely want to hear about the archival process, like how long that took. But one thing that, you know, that, for example, jumped out at me is the footage in Davos early on in the film. And, you know, Davos is kind of this, you know, mythic sort of place where only, you know, the leading thinkers of the globe actually get to attend. And as you can tell, I've never been. So I was really fascinated, but I love it, not just for the insight, but down to the subtleties, like subtleties like Jamie Dimon air kissing at the reception. I mean, these wonderful touches. And the same thing with the archival film clips. I saw things that, things on the, like environmental clips and pollution and global warming, like the orangutan falling on the construction machinery, and so I see all this stuff and I'm like, my goodness, talk a bit, please, about both that archival process and the kinds of access that you got to places like Davos.
Well, thank you so much for your observations, Brett. They're really interesting and quite gratifying to hear. And I mean, there's a lot in your question. On the one hand, there's this dissection which we do in terms of the rising trajectory of corporations being seen as the saviors for our society and our planet, and that sort of whole ideological bent in that direction. I think really very importantly, what we also examine is the flip side of that idea, which is the decline of our notion that government and democracy are the institutions which we can look for to try and ensure the common good, that can act on our behalf. And so there's sort of, on the one hand, in the last 40 years, this neoliberal dissing of government and our growing distrust of government and our cynicism related to government. And I mean, without question, there are evil governments, there are corrupt governments, but that we have lost in many ways the aspiration for democracy is so deeply troubling. And so we try and look at both the elevation of the corporation as savior, but also why is it that we have become increasingly cynical? So I think there's those two very parallel trajectories that we can chart historically, and we try to explore. I actually was having a family crisis at the time we were booked to go to Davos, so I didn't personally go to Davos, so Joel can certainly address that more directly. But we really tried to present it as the magic mountain and this sort of ideal space. And just so before Joel can comment more directly on that, like in terms of the accumulation of stock, this is a great time to shout out to our editor of the new corporation, Peter Rowick. I co-directed with Mark Akbar the first film and edited it and cut it from 400 hours. Hallelujah! I was deep in the trenches of another film, The Magnitude of All Things, and hallelujah, I did not edit the new corporation. That was Peter Rowick, and a lot of both films, the first film and this film, really were editorially driven in terms of it being a collection of stock and archival clips. And in the new corporation, which was just a huge and mammoth job in terms of finding and editing and brainstorming all of those images, there's 1,100 stock clips.
Wow.
So it's really, I think in fact, in terms of documentaries, I really don't think the corporation films, I can't actually think of another, I might be wrong, you might have an idea, but I can't really think of another documentary film that really collects the world as it's been documented and sort of then takes it and pieces it together with this content and emotional frame.
Yes, they're really amazing, and bravo to Peter as well. You mentioned, Joel. I want to circle back to the question that I had posed, but I'll change it just a bit. One of the things that you guys did so well in Davos, building this narrative around Jamie Dimon and the city of Detroit, was wow, just so powerful. So I should also ask, as you talk about it, why do you think that works so well in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were looking for in this film, and both the Jamie Dimon story, the Detroit story, and Davos itself all embody this. And it's this idea, like Jen was talking about, this kind of two-step between, on the one hand, saying corporations are great now and they can save the world, and on the other hand, saying governments have sort of had their day, they're ineffective, they're inefficient, we, corporations, can do a better job. Those two things have been going hand in hand for the last 20 years. Jen mentioned the word neoliberalism to describe this sort of trend that started in the 1940s of or the 1980s, 40 years ago, of market-led and market-driven policy, privatization, deregulation, all these things. I think what we're tracking in this film is this shift, this turn of neoliberalism into a more smiling face kind of neoliberalism, where it's no longer, Milton Friedman just saying dog eat dog, but rather it's corporations saying we'll save those dogs. That's the kind of shift that we see around 2005. So Davos definitely embodies that, and getting access to Davos was not at all easy. They turned us down because typically documentary film crews don't get to go to Davos, mainly broadcast news. So what I did is I got in touch with Klaus Schwab and his office and basically said he's the head of the World Economic Forum and he hosts Davos every year, and he has from the very start. And I just said, look, I'm really interested in this new corporation idea, and you're the guy who started it with your concept of stakeholder capitalism back in the 1970s. So, all these other things like Bill Gates' creative capitalism, natural capitalism, social capitalism, connected capitalism, those are all just, offshoots of your idea. So I want to talk to you. So I got an interview with him. We flew to New York and interviewed him. And I said at the end of the interview, by the way, it would be great to be able to come to Davos and, pursue these ideas a bit further. Can you help us out on this? And he did. And we got access to Davos, which was great. But Davos is really the embodiment of this idea. And then Jamie Dimon is the embodiment of this idea. Let's not forget, he heads the Business Roundtable. April 2019, the Business Roundtable comes out and says, it's all about stakeholder capitalism now. It's about communities. It's about the environment. We're changing the corporation. So Jamie Dimon is kind of the head of this whole new corporation movement in a way, or at least a cultural icon within it. So he's important. And then the story of Detroit is a perfect example of how it all comes together. Because here's a bank that basically, as we point out in the film, committed all kinds of legal infractions that helped cause the meltdown in 2008, that in turn helped destroy the city of Detroit. And then once Detroit is on its knees, once its government can't administer, it has no revenues, everything is falling apart, it goes bankrupt. And the biggest bank in the United States, led by Jamie Dimon, comes in and says, we're going to save you. And,
by the way, that's after the bank has derived the benefits of bailouts and
exactly
deregulation, et cetera, right?
All of that, and not only derived the benefits of all those things, but lobbied like crazy for all those things. And so there's just this crazy thing that's going on where it's kind of this quiet coup that I think we really need to be aware of big business saying, we are the saviors, we don't need government. You know who Richard Edelman is. He's, one of the world's leading gurus. Well, I caught up with him, as you see in the film, in the main square of Davos. And what did he say? He said, and I quote him, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. Well, if you don't believe in political citizenship, where's democracy? Isn't that what political citizenship is? And I think that really shows the mentality of this business elite that meets under the guise of good intentions in Davos every year, and this whole new corporation movement. It's leave it to us. We're in charge. We're good. We can run your schools, we can run your water systems, we don't need to be regulated, we can be self-regulated, and government has really seen its day. Well, if that's what you're saying in the United States or in Canada or in Britain or in Europe or in any other democratic society, if what you're saying is government is no longer relevant, then you're saying democracy is no longer relevant. And that's the real story of our film. The real story of our film is that the business elites today don't have a problem. In fact, they're pushing to see democracy in the rearview mirror. And to me, that's an even more profound threat, perhaps, than the current political regime in the United States.
Yes, and I mean, you know, in the film, you guys connect this to the rise in extremism and the rise of right-wing regimes that we see, and racial hatred, right? And the kinds of things that we've seen really kind of come to a head in recent months. One thing I'd like to ask you is, how do you think and please, Jennifer, jump in here if you'd like. How do you think the past few months have impacted this phenomena of corporations rebranding themselves as the solution, right? Has the pandemic accelerated the growing power of the new corporation?
Well, I would say I can discern like two trends that are going in opposite directions. You know, it feels to me like the pandemic, as we explore in our film, and, you know, we broke picture lock twice. One was because of the monumental event of the pandemic, and how it laid bare the injustices of the system, right? And it also, so I think in that sense, it's really has been a service to the revelation that maybe corporations aren't the saviors they say they are. It has shown the inefficiencies of the market, right? The market actually is not prepared to handle this crisis. And in fact, when we look at those countries who have been effective in reining in the pandemic, it is those that haven't dismantled social democracies, right? And even comparing Canada to the United States, the only difference between the two countries, I mean, the virus respects no border, right? But, you know, the line is drawn exactly along the border when you represent that with a color, as the New York Times does in red, in terms of per capita cases. And the red stops at the border, and it even goes to Alaska. Well, the only thing that is differentiating those two countries is public policy. So, you know, I think that the pandemic, on the one hand, really sort of revealed that corporations are not there to serve the common good. They're there to serve their shareholders. So there's that. But then, of course, sadly, we all know, and we can look at the rising wealth of Amazon and the rising wealth of the plutocratic class and how they have benefited. We can also look at how, you know, even through the dominance now of Zoom technology, like how the surveillance state, we can see technology becoming more and more important, and therefore the outsized power of high tech becoming even that much greater, right? So I kind of, like, on the one hand, it seems to me it's a real wake-up call, and a lot of people are really angry, and the whole the legitimacy of the system is being questioned. And people are seeing that government actually does have a place. And very importantly, that government can actually prioritize life instead of the economy. You know, that whole idea that has been, it's that, I think, is another very important spin-off from what has happened the last 2 months. So to try and answer your question more succinctly, like, it's obviously, and I know you likely agree, you know, it's very complicated, and there's all of these there's these competing threads, and that's why, like, I think it's such an interesting time to be alive, because, like, to me, who knows which direction this could go. I mean, it's not looking that great, honestly, but it feels like there's still a window of time to to rein in corporate power and to harness the disillusionment that people have been given, to harness that disillusion to create change, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And I tell you, I mean, I really think that you guys in the film, in such a profound way, you demonstrate, like what needs to be, the things that need to be reined in, right? This profit over safety. I mean, with the BP story, and my goodness, the interviews, from a journalist perspective, I'd like to hear about how you get that interview, but also, it just, it's like the proverbial fox watching the hen house, right? You make it so clear that with fewer regulations and with less oversight, et cetera, no matter what the company says, it's about profit over safety, which is really frightening, but comes across so clearly, I think, in the way that you guys put the film together.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. The interview with Lord John Brown that you're referring to, I mean, yeah. He comes across as a very decent person who genuinely believes the things that he professes. And as I was sitting across from him in London, I had no reason to doubt that. I really believe that inside his heart and soul, he believed that safety was important and was a priority. But here's the problem. He's working in an institution where for him to keep his job, for him to do his job properly, he has to always prioritize growth and profit and competitive advantage over everything else. That's what corporations do. That's what they're legally obliged to do. If he decided to pursue whatever environmental or safety beliefs he personally had and use shareholders' money to do that in a way that didn't generate returns for them, it would be no different from the perspective of corporate law than if he had taken their money and bought a chateau in the Swiss Alps. It's the same thing. He's not allowed to do that. It's not his money. Adam Smith talked about other people's money. And so this is the real, I think, problem in terms of how people are understanding corporations. They're not fungible institutions. They can pursue good, social or environmental, but only to the point where it's profitable for them to do so. They cannot sacrifice the good of their shareholders to the good of the environment or the good of society. And that gives them actually a very narrow framework in which to operate. And we show that with Lord John Brown. He focuses all of his safety efforts on personal safety, on ensuring that workers don't slip and fall, or that they have lids on their coffee, or don't drive while they're talking on their cell phones. Well, that's great. I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. And he was an industry leader in preventing those kind of accidents, but that costs his company nothing. The thing that really costs an oil and gas company money is dealing with what's called process safety, i.e. keeping gas in pipelines, keeping wells from losing what is in them and blowing up. And there, Lord Brown's BP did a terrible job. They sacrificed that kind of safety for profits and growth. And so on the one hand, Lord Brown really does believe these things. On the other, as a corporate leader, he always has to prioritize other things. And the analogy I use, and I'm speaking to you from Canada, so you could use any sport. You can use football, but I'm going to use ice hockey. And I know in Atlanta, it's a somewhat sad history in terms of ice hockey. But the analogy I use is you can have teams and you can have players who play the game violently, who play the game nicely, but they're all playing the same game. It has a certain set of rules, and it's a fairly violent game with hard surfaces, speed, and whatnot. And it's the same in the corporate world. If you're running a corporation, you're playing by a set of rules. And you can do that more nicely, more socially responsible, or less socially responsible. But you're still playing that game and you're bound by its rules. In hockey, if you're a hockey player and you give the puck away to the other team and say, oh, here, I want to be nice, here's the puck. you'll be fired. You know, you won't be playing anymore. And it's the same. It's exactly the same in a corporation. Like, there's an envelope to be pushed, but it's an envelope. There's a game to be played. It has certain rules. In terms of getting that interview with Lord Brown, again, you know, just wrote to his people and said, we're really interested in corporate social responsibility. You wrote a book about it called Connect. Can we talk to you? If they'd done their research, and maybe they did, they would have seen in my first book, I spent a whole chapter on Lord Brown and BP, and it's not that flattering. And that was in the early 2000s. But I think sometimes just the hubris of people in the upper echelons of business lead them to, you know, yeah, anyways, that's all he did. There was no tricks or anything, just called him up.
Well, it's great. And, you know, you point out that, you know, you think that, you know, he genuinely was focused on safety. Well, you know, it's kind of a similar analogy, I think, with Bill Gates and private for-profit schools. I mean, I would certainly say that, you know, that Gates' heart is really in it, right? And really, but, you know, nonetheless, I thought it was extremely fascinating to see really the other side of this and see a very different perspective. And as you guys pointed out, kind of what happens when societal issues are turned over entirely to a corporation. And I, you know, it wasn't clear how that corporation is doing. What was it, the bridge or something? But clearly the CEO, and I'm not sure that her title was CEO, but was, I think, made it clear that a return on investment to shareholders was paramount, ultimately. So it again, I thought was a very fascinating thing. One thing I'd like to ask you both before we wrap is, it's like one of the takeaways for me, and someone said this near the end of the film, is that it's a rigged system. And it may have been Robert Reich, who you had some wonderful interviews, some wonderful sound bites from. But, you know, towards the end, he talked about corporations currently in the midst of the pandemic looking for government bailouts. And those same corporations, as you guys have pointed out, have paid these record compensation packets to chief executive officers. And oftentimes it's because they've been able to get the stock price up because they spent, as Wright said, trillions of dollars buying back stock. He said, my goodness, if those trillions had been sitting somewhere for a rainy day, then they would have had it for this rainy day. So I thought that was extraordinary. But the question is, how do we fix this rigged system?
Well, I think, you know, that's the $1 million question, right? Or
Yes.
more, billion, trillion at this point. Million is hardly anything these days.
Where do we start?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I think that it's our philosophy that we start, first of all, by understanding the system is rigged, right? And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. I mean, even, you know, with the incredulity that we look at, like we're in Canada, and I mean, it's not like there aren't totally problematic things happening in our country as well, but the hypocrisy, the transparent hypocrisy that the US government betrays now. And actually, when to circle back to your first question, I had a very different response in terms of why we made the sequel. And it was actually at that moment when Trump was elected and the veil came down, and there was no longer even the pretense that corporations and government were acting independently, and they were just willing to rig the system in plain view. And so in some ways, they're kind of serving our agenda because they're not even hiding it anymore. right? And so I think the more we understand what's happening, and you know, we had to cut it, but Marshall Gantz tells a beautiful story, or he rather interprets the David and Goliath story. And we at one point had it in the film, but we had to cut it. And he points out, though, that that story, while it's a, you know, he doesn't necessarily agree with the violence inherent in it, what he does, it is drawn to, is that the motivation that David begins with is outrage. And so that sort of joins with what I'm saying earlier. You know, the more people see the system is rigged, the more then they feel outraged, and the more they also sort of forgive themselves, because so many people are struggling today, and of course neoliberalism focuses on the individual and not the collective, and so, you know, there's a whole dynamic social situation happening here. But, you know, I think there's three main things. You know, the system is rigged, that's in plain view. People feel outraged by it, and they also sort of forgive themselves and sort of understand that the system is almost impossible to work within. And then, you know, we have the motivation, okay, how do we change the system? And in the film, we document several successful movements doing exactly that. But, you know, and there is this groundswell, and I think knowing we're not alone, because there is a groundswell of resistance, and it is a critical moment in time. And so, you know, it's obviously complicated, but I think there's a lot of reason at this moment in time, we still have, you know, some cracks in the system. And if we can illuminate them, you know, maybe we can actually start to step off the cliff we're on.
Yes, yes. Yeah, there, you know, I think that you guys did wrap with some hints of optimism. That's for sure. Joel, please, I'll toss to you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what we try to show in the film are stories of people who have pursued a deepening of democracy. And I guess that's the best way that I can put it, that there seems to be a recognition that we may be losing democracy. And so, you know, what do we do? I think one of the stories that comes out of the film is, don't just focus on what's happening at the federal level. Think about democracy in your own community. Think about it in your city. Think about Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, and what he's trying to do. Think about how we can create a thick rather than the currently thin version of democracy. I think democracy can't involve simply giving everybody a vote and sort of leaving it at that, when you have massive influence of corporations on the government processes, when you have gerrymandering that dilutes the power of that vote, when you have levels of poverty and social dislocation and social inequality that make people that they're so focused on just surviving that they can't think about what they can do as citizens. So in the book, the argument I make, and it's implicit in the film, is that for political equality to work, which is what democracy demands, equal vote for everybody, there has to be some measure of social equality. There has to be some measure of an education system that ensures people are informed. There has to be some measure of people not feeling that they're entirely neglected and left behind by the community. How can you feel loyalty and feel that you're a part of a political community when you're socially excluded, when you're economically excluded from it? So I think we have to let go of this idea that we've been trained in, that, you know, all democracy means is we all have an equal vote, and we leave it at that. And so that's about policy, that's about activism, that's about activating ourselves as citizens, understanding that we're not going to change the world through just consumer behavior, but we have to take our responsibilities as citizens seriously. The most important thing, I think, in terms of a thought experiment, is to really think about the idea that we've been sold of capitalism. And I'm not saying that we should dispense with market systems. I believe in market systems. I'm not saying we should do away with corporations even. But what I am saying is that if our ism is capital, then that means that everything we do as a society has to be geared towards creating capital, with the hope that somehow stuff will trickle down to those who are not the necessary beneficiary as members of the capitalist class. So I know that sounds really radical and everything, but I'm just saying, think about the word. Shouldn't our society be democracism? I mean, isn't that what it should be? Because capitalism says in just that word that economic production, and in particular the creation of wealth for the owners of capital, has to be the ultimate goal of everything we do as a society. And that can't be right. What we need is a democratic society that has markets within it, that has corporations within it, not a democratic society that's within markets and within corporations. And that's what we've become. So, you know, we can't provide a 5-year plan for how to make everything right. And those who have provided 5-year plans in the past, not that great, hasn't worked out that well. So that's not what we can do. But what we can do with this film, and what we've tried to do, is just create some kind of implicit thought experiments and a few pathways about how we can think about what we can do. And hopefully that'll help nudge the conversation along, because it does need nudging.
Well, Joel, Bakan, and Jennifer Abbott, it is really fascinating and compelling and wonderfully done film. The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brett.